Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
In order to understand what's going on here, you have to understand that the previous section, the Talmud, the previous section was a critique of a rabbi named Rabbi Evyatar, a not very commonly quoted rabbi in the Talmud, and he's critiqued because he did not know a certain teaching by Rabbi Yitzchak, who was an earlier master. Right. So that's the buildup. Amar le Abai. Abai said to him, the person who critiqued Rabbi Evyatar for not knowing the teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak, Atu kol dela yada had Rabbi Yitzchak lav gavra rabbahu. Are you saying that just that anyone who doesn't know this random teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak is not a great man? That's reason enough to critique him? Bishlama milta detalya besvara. If the thing that Rabbi Yitzchak said that someone else didn't know depended on reasoning, you could say, yeah, if that person couldn't figure out that rationale, then that lowers him in our eyes as an intellectual. L'chaye, okay, fine, I accept. Ha gemarahi, but that thing that Rabbi Yitzchak taught, that Rabbi Evyatar didn't know about, Rabbi Yitzchak just received it from one of his teachers. The word Gemara in the Gemara means a teaching you heard from a teacher. So you can't know what you don't know. So you could have critiqued Rabbi Evyatar if he didn't have the mental facility to understand the reasoning behind the teaching that Rabbi Yitzchak taught. But just because he wasn't around, Rabbi Yitzchak heard of his teacher, you can't hold that against him. Ugmara lo shmiele. Okay, he didn't hear that teaching. Don't be so critical of him. Ve'od. And not only that, if you're going to go and so cheaply disregard and bring down the status of Rabbi Evyatar, I've got a story for you. Ha Rabbi Evyatar hu da'aski mare al yadeh. Rabbi Evyatar is the one, I would add, it really ends up being one of the ones that his master agreed with. Whom do we think his master might be? The master in the situation is God. Okay, it could have been something else. Rabbi Evyatar is not a servant. So who is our master? The master is the Holy One. And so Abai is saying that we have a tradition that Rabbi Evyatar was agreed with by God. That's a pretty good someone to come to your defense. Dichtiv, as it says, from the book of Judges, chapter 19, the beginning of a terrible, terrible narrative in the book of prophets that I won't get into the details now. The three-word quote is Vatizne alav pilak sho, that his concubine went away from him. If you know this terrible narrative, it's essentially a narrative of a concubine who they go to a town and she's ultimately ravaged and it's an awful, awful scene and killed. Okay, but what we're talking about here is that we have this three-word beginning of the story that his concubine left him. Rabbi Evyatar Amar. Rabbi Evyatar, the one who, right, because it really, Vatizne means that she kind of like whored away from him. It's interesting. I think the pshat of the verse is that this is just a synonym for fleeing from him. But you're right that the root Vatizne has to do with the word zonah, which means a certain sexual licentiousness. Rabbi Evyatar Amar, there's the rabbis question every detail of every narrative, and they want to know why. It's interesting, for this section, they're not focusing on the horrific nature of the story, but on the one detail, what made her leave her man, which began a narrative that ended up with a disaster. Rabbi Evyatar Amar, Rabbi Evyatar said, Zvuv Matzala, because he found a fly with respect to her. It's very, it's hard to understand exactly what that's a reference to. Rabbi Yonatan Amar, Rabbi Yonatan said, Nima Matzala. He found her a hair. He found a hair regarding her. So, first of all, they're reading it as if that she fled because he was dissatisfied with her. And the question is, what happened, that this concubine in the 19th chapter of Judges, what did she do such that he was dissatisfied with her, such that she ran away, which began a series of dominoes that led to a disaster? One is that some kind of a fly, maybe a fly was found in her soup, like a Ratner's joke, or his soup, and she was supposed to serve him. And another that a hair was found, and we'll figure out exactly what that might be referring to, right? If you're focused on cleanliness, then if you find a hair where it's not supposed to be, that might drive you crazy. As you'll see, the rabbis understand this hair to be a little more lurid than that. Va'ashkechei Rabbi Evyatar le'Eliyahu. This happens in the Talmud. Earthly rabbis bump into Elijah, the prophet who never died, right? The Tanakh says that he disappeared but doesn't die. That's why he comes to visit us on Pesach. He visits us in a few minutes and at Havdalah, and he visits every bris. Evyatar was walking around after he disagreed with Rabbi Yonatan about what was the source of her leaving, and he bumps into Elijah, Amarle. He said to Elijah, "You've got an audience with God all the time as you hover in between the realms. Mai ka avid hakadosh baruch hu. What's the Holy One doing right now?" Right? If you had an opportunity to run into someone who knew what God was doing, wouldn't you ask? Amarle, Elijah said to him, Asek befilegesh bagiva. Wouldn't you know it? God right now is studying Tanakh. And what story in Tanakh is God studying? The very story that you were discussing with Rabbi Yonatan. God is also, it's such a wonderful image. It's ridiculous, of course, but it's wonderful that the rabbis of the Talmud imagine that the thing that's happening up in the heavens is exactly what they're doing, right? And it's hard to know who's mirroring who. Are we mirroring God, or is God mirroring us? God is in Chavruta and studying the story. And so Rabbi Evyatar says, basically, who was right? Mai ka'amar. How does God understand that story? I disagree with Rabbi Yonatan. Was it a fly that sent her away, or was it hair? Turn the page. Amarle, Elijah said to him, Evyatar b'ni kachu omer. Elijah said, I heard God say, Evyatar, my son, read it this way. Yonatan b'ni kachu omer. And Jonathan, my son, read it this way. By the way, already we've resolved the thing that we began with, because we began with Rabbi Evyatar being critiqued for not knowing a teaching rabbi, was it Yitzchak? Rabbi Yitzchak. The story continues, but the resolution was already, you're going to critique Rabbi Evyatar? God quotes Rabbi Evyatar. It doesn't say if he agreed with Rabbi Evyatar, but if you're quoted by God as one of the positions, how you're going to interpret a certain verse Tanakh, that's the thing. You're no nachschlepper, okay? You're not a nothing. So don't critique until you get quoted by God. Until Elijah says that God is quoting you, don't go around poo-pooing the teaching of Rabbi Evyatar. But the story continues. Amarle, he said to him, this is Evyatar back to Elijah. Chas v'shalom, how could it possibly be? Umi ika sveka kameshmaya. How could God be confused? Because the image is that God was saying, well, I don't understand this verse. Rabbi Evyatar says it was a fly. Rabbi Yonatan says it was a hair. And Rabbi Evyatar, it's like we don't see him responding to the great ego boost, knowing that God is quoting him. He's saying, God doesn't know the answer? If God doesn't know the answer and God is confused, then what does this whole system mean? Right? How could there be doubt in front of God? Amarle, Elijah said to him, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hein. One of several, this is a less famous version, places where the Talmud ascribes to God or a divine voice that multiple opinions can have validity. What a concept, right? So Elijah said, it's not that God is confused. God heard Rabbi Evyatar's position, said, that makes sense. God heard Yonatan's position, says, and that makes sense. And he's quoting both of them. They're both the words of the living God. Zvuv matzala lohikpid. That man had found a fly in whatever context. Didn't bother him. Nema matzah, he also found a hair, and that's what sent him over the edge. So, in other words, Elijah quotes God as quoting Rabbi Yonatan and Rabbi Evyatar, both of whom were right. This man in the story did find a fly, and found a hair, but it was the hair that drove him crazy, and it sent him away. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, this is later on. Rabbi Yehuda said, Zvuv, Zvuv b'ka'ara v'nema ba'oto makom. What would be the reason that a fly or a hair would make someone act this way? Perhaps a fly came in his dish, v'nema ba'oto makom, and a hair in that place. That is euphemism, my friends, right? A hair in that place.
the place that the rabbis don't want to mention by name, the place on a body that the rabbis don't want to mention by name. He found a hair in that place. Interesting, Rashi says on this, I don't know if you want to know this, Rashi says on this that this was a shaving incident, and that shaving that area was considered commonplace, and one hair was left over, and since a hair was left over, it could injure him upon his coming too close. Now you know that, you can't unknow it, okay? But that would drive him, that would be a reason to send her away. Zvuv, miusata. Yeah, it's true that a fly is gross in your soup. The nema sakanta, but a hair in the wrong place, in the wrong act, could be a danger. Okay, we'll leave it there. Iga de amre, some people say, idi ve'idi bekara, they both agree that it was that the hair and the fly was in a dish. Zvuv unsa. The fact that the fly got there, unsa, ones, you could do nothing about it. Can you really defend your soup against a fly diving into it? No. The nema pshiyuta. But the hair arriving was a matter of transgression. It was a matter of not paying enough attention. If you're preparing a kitchen, you should be able to keep a hair out. You may not be able to keep a fly out. It's true in a restaurant. That's true. Right.
I mean, if you were to find a hair it's true in a restaurant. If you were to find a hair in your soup, they would bring you a new soup.
Right.
If you find a fly in the soup, that's part of eating outdoors.
Right. Right. And then again, in nearly every Lower East Side Ratner's joke is built on that concept. What's that fly doing in my soup? The breaststroke. Backstroke, breaststroke. Okay, so that's the end of the first source. And I brought it to you as a way of explaining, first of all, how deep the rabbis go into minutia of stories. Sometimes it seems like they're doing it to avoid the parts of the story that are problematic, because it's almost like crazy to be studying this awful story of the Pilegesh from this chapter of Judges and be wondering whether it was a fly or a hair that made her go away, or that's just the rabbinic comprehensive digestion of biblical text, and every question you have on it has to be resolved. And I love the idea of someone critiquing a rabbi for not knowing something that he thought he should know, and then being critiqued himself, saying, that rabbi is quoted by God up in heavens. This image that everything we're doing, what we're doing right now, it's being mirrored in the supernal realm. That's text number one. Okay, text number two. Text number two is actually just the Mishnah. So the Talmud is Mishnah and commentary on the Mishnah, but this one I bring to you, it's pure Mishnah. It's not from the later text, the Gemara. And it's from page 41 in Gittin. Matnitin, in our Mishnah. Shechetzio Eved vechetzio ben chorin. We had that concept this morning, if those of you were in the sanctuary. There was a legal category of someone who was half slave servant and half free. And I'll give the same caveat I gave earlier. Whatever we think of biblical and rabbinic discussion of slavery, it wasn't pretty. I don't want to romanticize it. It would be better to not be a slave than be a slave. It was not chattel slavery that America perfected in the 16, 17, 1800s, right? So don't think of that. Think of mostly someone having to sell themselves in order to pay off a debt, and eventually that would be either it would be remitted or he would be set free for another reason. And there was a situation where if you had to sell yourself into slavery to pay off a debt, you could have collected enough money to buy half of yourself. There was a category where you were half a totally free person and half a person claimed owned by someone else. So the Mishnah says, if you're half servant, slave, and half free, oved et rabo yom echad, one day you serve your master, ve'atzmo yom echad, and you serve yourself. What does serving yourself mean? It means that the output of your labor goes to you. Where on Monday, anything you produce belongs to your master. On Tuesday, everything you produce belongs to you. Okay. Divrei Beit Hillel. That's what Beit Hillel says. Beit Shammai Omrim, and we all know that whenever Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are quoted, we know who's going to be the winner in the academic debate. Beit Shammai says, Tikantem et rabo, vid atzmo lo tikantem. Beit Hillel, by creating this category of someone who's half slave and half free, you think you've done an act of chesed, because you think you've released that slave to at least spend half of his time producing for himself. But what actually did is tikantem et rabo. You've corrected things for his master. Et atzmo lo tikantem. You did not correct things for him. Why? Lisa shivch, because forget about his ability to be industrious and earn money for himself. What about his ability to fulfill another very significant part of being alive, and that is having a spouse or having a partner and producing? Lisa shivcha yefshar. This half slave, half free person can't marry a female slave. Shekvar chatzio ben chorin, because half of him is free, and the law was that a free person can marry a free person, a claimed person can marry a claimed person, but never the twain shall meet. But chorini afshar, he can't go and marry a free woman, shekvar chatzio eved, because half of him is still a slave. And then a one-word profound question: yibatel, should he just give up? Give up what? Give up partnership? Give up intimacy? Give up a life with another just because he happens to have this odd status? The world was only created so that man and woman would find each other and engage in pru urvu, in being fruitful and multiply. So don't just say, all right, he'll leave and he'll live his life celibate. By the way, this Mishnah was used tangentially but very poignantly in some of the arguments in the 90s and the 2000s regarding what the halachic status should be of same-sex attraction. Because it's not a small thing to tell a human being in our tradition, this is the way you are. Unfortunately, there is no religious category that will permit you to have intimacy, so you'll have to live a life of intimacy, without intimacy. That is not taken very lightly in our tradition. And Beit Shammai challenges Beit Hillel. You're going to subject this half-free person, half slave to a life without being fruitful and multiply? And by the way, then I stopped mid-argument. Beit Shammai is still in the lecture back to Beit Hillel. Shenamar, as it says in the 45th chapter of Isaiah, Lo tohu v'ra'ah lashevet yitzara. God did not create the world for tohu, for wildness and abyss, but rather lashevet, in order for it to be inhabited, which is a reference to it be inhabited by people who are creating more people. Elam bipnei tikkun olam. Therefore, in order for the betterment of this world, and particularly for the betterment of anyone who finds himself in that situation, kofin et rabo, you force the master, v'oseoto ben chorim, to make him free, v'chotev shtar al chatzei damav, and the half of himself that he doesn't yet have enough money to pay back his master, he basically writes a document. It's an IOU, right? So when I was fully your slave, I worked for you. I owed you 10 dinar. I come up with 5 dinar. I've paid you 5 dinar. Rather than leave the person in a purgatory, have him write an IOU. I owe you 5 dinar, but my status is of what? A free person. And since my status is of a free person, I now am free to marry, because if you have to choose between having the person stay free or stay enslaved, our tradition is always going to choose staying free, but I owe you something. These are the following lines are some of my most favorite lines in all the Mishnah. V'chazru Beit Hillel laharod k'divrei Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel said, you know what? That makes sense. You're right. This is one of the few times that the law goes according to Beit Shammai. And not only does the law go according to Beit Shammai, but Hillel, we see it happening in real time. But Hillel articulated a position. He thought he was really, they thought they were very clever, that this half status. Beit Shammai says, you might be clever in terms of halachic status, but you're cruel when it comes to personal status. And Beit Shammai was known as the ones who were more stringent, who were more punctilious. In this case, they're saying to Hillel, you're actually, you're being hung by our petard on some level. You're ruling the way we would normally act. But we understand that in this situation, you would be enforcing a cruelty upon the status. And Beit Hillel says, you know what? You're right. Alan.
Just a numeric question.
Yeah.
How many times in the machlok between Hillel and Shammai did Shammai prevail? Because I know there's a Talmudic expression, Ya'al Kegam, B'diuk, about food sixism. I don't know who it's between, Ya'al Kegam, about what is, that's not Hillel and Shammai, it's somebody else. Is it another rabbi?
You're asking how many times does Beit Shammai win?
Yeah.
It's known, and it was once known by me, but I don't remember.
Yeah. But are you familiar with what Michael just said with respect to Ya'al Kegam?
No, is that related to Yaknahaz? Abai and Rabbah? Mm-hmm. Which it's a mnemonic for which which arguments one over the other?
Yeah, I just remember that Gimel was Gilui Rayot.
Got it.
But
Arayot. Yes, in this Mishnah, basically Beit Shammai says to Beit Hillel that category cannot exist, because even if you could make the argument that it could exist from an economic perspective, it cannot exist from a relational perspective, so we abolish it. Right? And go Beit Shammai, and in some ways go Beit Hillel for recognizing that the ruling would have led to cruelty. We want to wield our Torah with a certain precision, but we do not want to wield our tradition with cruelty. What time is? I have a few more minutes. Okay, I have a few more minutes. Do I have time to do the next one?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, Gittin 52a. This is the third source. Apotropos, you can hear in the word that it's a Greek word. It has to do with a steward, particularly someone who was entrusted to take care of orphans. And when you're entrusted to take care of orphans in the Talmud, you're mostly entrusted to take care of their finances. It's not about making sure that they have their lunch ready in the morning, but make sure that any money that was left to them by their parents, by their father, is not disappeared in the system. Hahu apotropos. There was this apotropos, Dahava b'shivavavute de Rabbi Meir. He lived in the neighborhood of Rabbi Meir. And the fact that we're calling him an apotropos, it means that he was responsible for orphans. Dahava kamizabein arata v'zabein avde. And it was found out that he was selling land, you see I put in the parentheses, belonging to orphans, and purchasing slaves. Now, there's a whole section earlier in the Talmud that talks about the fact that there's a hierarchy of what you can save, you can sell, particularly when you're responsible for someone else's assets, right? And the idea is that to this day, on some level, real estate is thought to be more valuable than movable property. And I know it sounds crazy, but they understood servants to be movable property. And you cannot downgrade the assets of someone whom you are responsible for, right? If you're thinking modern economic terms, you're a fiduciary, right? You can't sell this position to that position even if it temporarily enriches you, because if it jeopardizes the person that you're a fiduciary for, because your ultimate responsibility is to steward that person's assets, right? So he's doing something that the tradition already said he's not supposed to do. V'lo shavki Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir did not let him. He heard about it because it was in the neighborhood. He did not let him. Achavo le bechalme. They showed it to him in a dream. This is another vague reference, like who's the they and who's the him. It means that he was dreaming, and they, like the ministering angels, God's representatives, appeared to Rabbi Meir in the dream and said, Anila haros v'ata livnot. Very cryptic. I am coming to destroy, and you are coming to build. What could that possibly mean? Rabbi Meir has done something to protect the assets of orphans, and somehow he gets a prophecy in the middle of his dream. And the prophecy from the divine realm basically saying, I intended to destroy, meaning I let this happen, let this apotropos sell the assets of the orphans. It wouldn't have happened and I let it. And you're coming to build. The many commentary, look at the source 4 for commentary on this. This is the commentary called the Chochmat Shlomo, the commentary on the Talmud by the Maharshal, Moreno Harav Rabbi Shlomo Luria in Poland. What does it mean? Anil haros v'ata livnot. That nun bet in the second line, nired be'enai, it seems to me, the Perush, the commentary is, lefisha mamon azvun avihem, that the money that the father had left these orphans, that the apotropos was responsible to protect, hayaba bi'isur. It was money that had come in an illicit fashion, it had come through a prohibition. O ayadei gzela, or it had come via stealing. Vesheker, or deceit. O ayadei ribit, or it had come through usurious interest. In other words, you, Rabbi Meir, were trying to be righteous and protect these assets for the orphans, but these are bad assets. They came from awful places. And yes, we feel bad for the orphans, but they shouldn't have had them in the first place because the way the person, their father, got these assets was through prohibited acts. So you think you were doing a righteous act, you were actually getting in the way of a righteous act. Because what I was doing was basically getting rid of these assets so that these orphans didn't have an attachment to assets that had a bad source. I'm sure you've heard many parables like that, where depending on how you focus the camera, you see one act and it looks one way, you pull back out and it looks entirely opposite. You pull back out, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what's happening here in the Talmud. Rabbi Meir is a venerable rabbi. He thought he's doing something to protect the assets of the orphans, and God comes to him in a dream and says, no, those are bad assets. Turn the page. Oh, not turn the page. Go up to the previous source. Afilu hachi lo ashkach. Even though he heard from God or God's angels in a dream that they did not appreciate, did not accept the fact that he had canceled the sale, lo ashkach, he paid them no attention. Amar, he said, divrei chalamot lo ma'alin v'lo moridin. Things you hear in a dream neither raise or lower, meaning you don't pay attention to it. They don't impact your decision. If God wants to tell me while I'm awake, I'll listen. But while I'm sleeping, I'm paying no attention to it, and I am more concerned with the well-being of the orphans than I'm concerned about the schmutz by which their father had accumulated those assets.
Well,
Michael.
God may know that he accumulated by schmutz, but Rabbi Meir doesn't.
Right. And he's not accepting the testimony of the night. Right?
That's it.
Right. Great. Since we were talking about since we're talking about Rabbi Meir, the next thing in the Talmud, this is source number 5, but it's just the next words in the Talmud, is another sweet little story about Rabbi Meir that shows that Rabbi Meir was not only willing to go against God, but he was actually willing to go against someone else. Hanhu be tre di igare buhu Satan. There were two people, also in the neighborhood, that Satan, to the Talmud and the rabbis, Satan is a real force. It's a character, right? You have that in the holiday liturgy. He's the one up in the supernal tribunal who is trying to convince God against accepting our tshuva. And so what does Satan do? He mixes people up. If two people are angry with each other, it's because Satan is behind it. So there were two people that Satan was turning against one another. Dechol Beis Shimshei. Literally that means every house of the sun. What does it really mean? Look at Rashi, that's the source 6. Chol Beis Shimshei shel Erev Shabbat. Every Friday afternoon as the sun would go back and go down into its house. So every Friday afternoon, two guys were fighting. Havu kam minsu bahade hadade. And they would fight with one another. Ikla Rabbi Meir lahatam. Rabbi Meir, walking down the street, would see that these two nice guys in his neighborhood cannot stop arguing and fighting and hurt each other Erev Shabbat. That's not the way Shabbat should begin in this neighborhood. Akvinhu tlata Beis Shimshei. 3 Erev Shabbats in a row, Rabbi Meir got in between them and said, not on my watch. I'm not going to allow you to start Shabbat with a fight. Ad da'avid luhu shlama. Until he made peace between them. What an amazing guy. He's protecting orphans and he's bringing peace in the neighborhood. Shamei deka amar. So in his sleep, he heard God's angels telling him something that he ultimately rejected. Now he also hears Satan speaking to himself. He heard that Satan said, I know that it doesn't say Satan in there, but that's what's going on. Vai, oi, da apke Rabbi Meir lahahu gavra mi beite. This is cryptic Aramaic language. Rabbi Meir heard someone, the someone is Satan, saying, oh my God, Rabbi Meir really threw that man out of his house. What's that a reference to? Who's that man? Satan. I had found my way. I had insinuated myself in between these people. And I was enjoying it. That's what I like to do, Satan. I like to mix people up. And along comes Rabbi Meir and throws me out of the house. And now I got to go find some other place to get involved. So these two stories, it's interesting. I would have preferred them rhetorically in reverse. To first show Rabbi Meir someone who is willing, which we all should be willing to do, to be against Satan in the world, but then is also willing to basically reject a suggestion of God that comes to him in the dream. That takes a certain amount of holy chutzpah. Okay, so that's Rabbi Meir. And now we get to the very end of Masechet Gittin, and that will be our siyum. In order to understand the last few lines of the tractate, you have to look at one verse from the prophet Malachi. By the way, tractates of Talmud end with a flourish, meaning it's been very legalistic for pages and pages, and then we get to like a final piece of sermonica. And remember, this entire tractate is about how to separate a man from a woman. What are the financial implications? Because divorce is a mitzvah. Which was a book written by Rabbi Perry Netter. But it's true, because the laws about divorce appear in the Torah. It is, mitzvah doesn't mean you should do it. Necessarily. It means that if one does it, this is the way one should do it. It's a mitzvah to operate a divorce according to a certain way. The prophet Malachi, Kisanei shalach amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael. It's too bad that this is the translation I brought, because the translation almost makes the Talmud a bit less interesting, because it could mean many things. But kisanei shalach literally means, for I, God, hate sending. It's understood to be the sending away. I don't like divorce. Amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael. V'chisa chamas al levusho. You're covering up your own lawlessness with some, garment of an effective document. V'nishmartem beruchachem v'lo tivgodu. So be careful and don't act treacherously, meaning preserve your relationships. Divorce is the final option. Okay. This is the last few lines of Masachet Gittin, 90 pages dealing with divorce. They quote the prophet Malachi, Kisanei Shalach, literally, for God hates sending, or something having to do with sending. And the Talmud ends on a machloket, ends in a disagreement. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im Seneta Shalach. You could read it not that God hates sending, but ki, if, saneh, if there's hate, shalach, meaning if enmity has grown in the relationship, you could read Malachi saying, then the command is shalach, send the other person away, meaning pro-divorce. Pro-divorce if there's hate, pro-divorce if there's contempt. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, sanui hamshaleach, the one who does the sending away is hated. So we have a machloket on the 92nd page of this tractate. Is it the case that if there's enmity in a relationship, that it's the proper thing to send yourself away from the other person? Or if you are the one who initiates that, you are hated. V'lo plige, they don't disagree. Ha bezug rishon, ha bezug sheni. One of them is referring to a first marriage, and one of them is referring to a second marriage. The idea, do you have a sense of which one is which? Which one are they attaching to the first, which to the second, Carl?
Sending is bad in a second marriage. Divorce is bad because you should have known better by then and not had to divorce the second time.
Okay, so a modern interpretation might be, right? Your first marriage was a trial, marriage is hard, okay. But by the second time, you should have learned from your mistakes, and therefore don't let yourself be in that situation. By the way, the national divorce rate is significantly higher among second marriages than in first marriages. Most people do not learn what they're supposed to learn, and it's the exact opposite of how the rabbis understood it. Da'amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said, "Kol hemegaresh ishto rishona." Anybody who divorces his first wife, afilu mizbeach morid alav dmaot. The altar itself cries when an initial marriage is over. So the idea is that the one who said that if you send away, you're the hated one, that's on the first marriage. Second marriage, all right, maybe marriage isn't for you. It's okay. Shneimar, as it says, also from the book of Malachi, just a few verses later. A few verses later. No, sorry, a few verses earlier, excuse me. The previous verses, leading up to those verses. V'zot shenit ta'asu. Also do this. This is, by the way, how the entire tractate ends. Kasot dima et mizbach Adonai. You cover with tears the altar of God. Bechiva anaka me'ein od panot elamincha. So much weeping that God doesn't even pay any attention to what you're bringing to that altar. V'lakachta ratzon mi'edchem. You have and is no longer able to receive with will what you offered. V'amartem amma, and you're going to say, for what reason? Al ki Adonai he'id bencha. God is a witness between you. Uvein eshet nu'urecha, and between the wife of your youth. Asher ata bagadta ba, that you were treacherous regarding. Vehi chavertecha, she is your fellow. Ve'eshet britecha, and the wife of your covenant. Mic drop. That's how the Trier Tractate ends. It's fascinating. For 91 pages, the rabbis have been working through every possible legal, financial, structural law and detail regarding how divorce should be. And the tractate ends saying, don't do it. Stay away from it if you can. Right? And quoting a prophet for basically saying that when this happens in the wrong circumstances, it causes God's altar to weep so much that nothing you bring in the aftermath of that is going to be received. It's harsh. It's rhetorical. It is. It's pushing a line, and it's fascinating that the rabbis recorded this and codified this. That this is how they end 91 pages dealing with this topic. They basically say at the end, this topic hurts our heart. We'd rather have a Masechet couples therapy than Masechet Gittin. If it has to happen and you want to figure out how to do it, read the last 91 pages. But for God's sake, folks, try to make it work the first time, because there is tears in the world when relationships break down. Okay? To me, that is it's an ancient modern wisdom and rhetoric that is coming through these pages. Last comment, and then I'm going to do the siyum because we're out of time. Yes?
Just a question.
Yeah.
The man.
Yeah, it's a good question. What Larry asked of the Zoomers is this mostly not a critique of marriage ending, but of a man initiating that? I think that's probably read wisely, and yet more interesting given the fact that all this material is written by men, right? And they're ending this tractate saying, and you who are reading this, or you who are a part of creating this, when you're the one in the situation, resist at as much as possible. Actually, we hope this tractate is never used. We hope. Yeah, we hope that this tractate is defunct. What an interesting way to end 91 pages of rabbinic material. And we say, Hadran alach hamagaresh. We're going to return to you, Hamagaresh, which is the name of this chapter. Uslika la Masechet Gittin, and we have completed Masechet Gittin. Please rise as I read the Hadran. Hadran alach Masechet Gittin vehadrachalan. I'm not going to translate because it's long. Basically, we return and we revere you, Tractate Gittin, and we're going to come back to you. V'datan alach Masechet Gittin v'datach alan lo nitneshe minach Masechet Gittin v'lo titneshe minan la ba'alma hadein v'la ba'alma da'ate. You're supposed to say that 3 times, but Shabbat's over soon. Yirat som v'necha Adonai Eloheinu v'lo v'teinu shetehei toratcha umanotenu ba'olam hazeh utehei imanu lam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abai Mari bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Bar Papa had lots of kids. Harev da Eloheinu durei torcha befinu befifiyot Chabe Israel. V'nei kulanu anachnu b'tzeitzeinu b'tzeitzeim Chabe Israel kulanu udei shemech v'lomdei toratecha. Me'ovai techakmenu mitzvotecha kilam hili bi tamim b'chukecha laman lo yevosh leolam lo eshkach pikudecha kivam b'chitani. Baruch atah Adonai lamdeni chokecha, amen, 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 sela v'ed. Modim anachnu lefanecha, Eloheinu levatenu, shesamta chalkenu miyoshvei beit hamidrash, v'lesamta chalkenu miyoshvei karnot, she'anu mashkichim v'hem mashkimim, anu mashkimim l'divrei Torah v'hem mashkimim l'divarim b'dehlim, anu amilim v'hem amilim, anu amilim u'mekablim schar, v'hem amilim v'einam mekablim schar, anu ratzim v'hem ratzim, anu ratzim l'chei olam haba, v'hem ratzim l'ver shachat. In other words, we're spending our time doing things that matter and building the world, and there are people out there who spend their time doing nonsense. Shnamar v'atalohim toridem lever shachar anshe damim umirma lo yechatsu yimehem ani eftach bach. Yiratzon v'necha Elohai shekashem she'azartani l'sa'im masechet Gittin. Just as you helped me to start this tractate, kein tazreni l'atchil masechtot usfarim acharim. Please help me study and complete others. U'l'saimam l'mod l'amei l'shmor v'litzvor l'asot l'ukayem akol divrei toratecha b'yava. U'zchut kol ta'aneim v'amoraim v'tamidei chachamim yamod li l'zari shalo tamush ha'torah mipi zari v'zera zri erolam v'yitkayem bi b'halechacha tanche otach v'shachbecha tishmor alecha v'hakitzotah hitesichecha kivi yirbu yemecha V'yosifu lecha shnot chayim, orach chamim b'yimina u'b'smola osher v'chavod, Adonai ozeh moyitein, Adonai yvarech et amo v'shalom. Yitkadal v'yitkadash, Shemei Rabba, Yamadehu atilid atcharata u'lachaya mataya u'lasaka lachaya alama u'lemavnei karta d'Yerushalayim u'lishachlel hechala b'gava u'lema'akar puchana nuchra'a me'ara u'liatava puchana d'shmaya la'atrei v'yamlich kuchabrichu B'malchutevik v'karei b'chayechon v'mechon v'chedechu b'Yisrael v'agala v'zman kari v'yamru amen Yehei Shemei Rabba Mavarach le'elam amen Maya Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitparjuma v'yinasei v'yidrav v'yidelev v'yidelash v'yinukudusha b'richu Le'elam mikol brachata v'shirata tushchad b'nechamata damran b'alama v'yamru amen Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidei Yom v'al kol Tamidei v'al kol man daskim b'araita di v'yatra hadein v'di b'chol atar v'yatar Yehei lohon shlama rabba china v'chisa v'rachmi m'chayar v'chei umzanar v'chei ufor kana min kodam abohon di v'shmaya v'yamru amen Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim tov v'malena v'koyesel v'yamru amen Oseh shalom v'romav v'yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru amen. Shkayach. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining me with this.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.